All right, everybody, it looks like it's 4 o'clock, so I guess we'll get started here. I know some people are still joining us, but that'll be okay. So welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Michaela Fundan, and I'm the Curator of Interpretation here at the Estes Park Museum. Just a couple of announcements before we get started. As it sometimes happens with virtual programs, if we do encounter any tech issues, please bear with us, and we'll get things right back on track. Currently, the museum gallery is still closed to visitors, but we are regularly evaluating and will provide updates when that status can change. During this time of closure, we are looking for new ways to stay engaged remotely, so please continue to check our website and Facebook pages for any updates. You can find past programs on YouTube via our website as well. Again, if you have any questions for Dr. LaBelle today, please use the Q&A box, and I'll be watching that throughout the program so we can get him questions near the end. So today I would like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Jason LaBelle is the director of the Center for Mountain and Plains Archaeology and an associate professor of anthropology at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. His research interests include grassland and mountain ecology, hunter-gatherer site structure, communal hunting, hearth cooking, and the history of archaeology. His current fieldwork focuses on the foothills and mountains of northern Colorado, but past fieldwork has taken him across the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains, spanning from New Mexico to Montana. He has served as the past president of the Colorado Archaeological Society, the Colorado Council of Professional Archaeologists, and on the board of directors for the Plains Anthropological Society. He has published articles in journals such as American Antiquity, Plains Anthropologist, and North American Archaeologist. His research efforts are supported in part by the Jim and Audrey Benedict Fund for Mountain Archaeology, an endowment established in 2011 to support alpine archaeology in the Southern Rocky Mountains. Jason was awarded the Stephen H. Hart Award from History Colorado for his statewide efforts in archaeological research and public education. So welcome, Dr. LaBelle.
Well, thanks so much. Glad to be here today. Greetings from Fort Collins. So I'm happy to kind of share with you some fun stuff that we're doing in the mountains just outside of Estes. And welcome. It's nice to have this rescheduled. A little scary last time we had this plan, and things have kind of finally calmed down in our communities in terms of the fires and such. So what I'll be talking about today is, let me get the slides to work here. I'm going to talk about Colorado mountain archaeology and a couple things about it. I think the first thing is that most folks would think that our earliest inhabitants of the state, our Native American populations, might not have used mountains very intensively, that we've always thought of these places as being wilderness. But the contrary is the truth, that the mountains have been used since the first peoples arrived in this continent some 10 to 12,000 years ago, at least here in Colorado. So I'll talk about that a little bit. And then I'm going to be talking about kind of a really distinct kind of pattern that we have here in Colorado, and that's the idea of these alpine hunting traps. And I'll be talking about Rollins Pass in particular, which is just south of Estes Park. And this contains the densest concentration of these kinds of sites in all of North America. It's just right here in the Front Range. Most of them date to the last couple of thousand years ago, but it's this concept of communal hunting where people are coming together to really share the yields of this kind of a communal type event. And that's what makes these a really kind of special kind of archaeological site. So I'll be reviewing these things in the coming minutes today. This work's conducted by my Center for Mountain and Plains Archaeology, which is my research group of undergraduates, graduate students, as well as volunteers. And we work in all the different ecosystems of Colorado, from the shortgrass prairies to the mountains to the alpine, all the way over towards Dinosaur National Monument and the kind of canyon countrylands far to the west and the western slope. And we work on a variety of topics that span the last 13,000 years or so. So it's a really nice kind of way of organizing this research. And part of this research is alpine focused. And we like to do this because, you know, obviously by the time you get to July, August, down here in the Front Range or over by Rangeley, for example, it gets pretty darn hot. And we like to go up into the high country and spend late July, August, when school usually starts. And we try to continue on weekends going all the way into late September and early October, really, if we can, before the first snows fly. So here's examples of student crews that I've run. This is the field school that I run, working on CU's mountain property at Niwot Ridge, just south of Estes a couple years ago. Here we are surveying or looking for archaeological sites that have not been documented before. And then when we find them, we get to crawl across the landscape and kind of document all the little tiny pieces that were left behind by ancient peoples and try to figure out how all these things kind of fit together. And so here's a student working at Rollins Pass, and you can see down below, there's an old lake down there as well as that kind of sinuous pathway. That's the old railroad, and I'll be talking about that in the coming minutes. And part of what we're trying to understand is how peoples of the past, ancient Native American populations, used the Front Range. And where I live down on Fort Collins, down to Boulder, Denver, all the way south to Colorado Springs, Pueblo, has always been some of the most expensive and richest property in Colorado, this hogback zone, those red beds. Real estate prices today are just outlandish in that kind of right next to the mountains kind of front. And it's always been a really prized place to live for the last 13,000 years ago. And that's why I-25 goes down right adjacent to that from essentially the northern part of our state to the southern part of our state. And so archaeologists have developed models to try to understand how peoples live down here on the Front Range, but then also interacted with Estes Park, as well as the alpine, as well as these higher altitude basins that are located to the west of the Front Range. And so places like the Laramie Basin here, which if you just drive up 287 from Fort Collins, come into Laramie Basin, North Park, and Middle Park. And when early ethnographers, zoologists, explorers came into these places in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, they generalized that these were the Serengetis of the Western United States. They were filled, teeming with antelope and bison and elk all over the place. George Burgernell, when he was moving between North Park and Middle Park here, right at the pass at Muddy Pass, actually saw wooden drive lines at the pass itself that the Ute had just abandoned within the last decade or so. So people like Jim Benedict, the late Jim Benedict, a fabulous geoarchaeologist who lived and worked in this region, has come up with a variety of land use models, and these are just kind of simplified ways of helping us understand how people might use these mountain landscapes. The first one is called this up-down system, and the idea is that people live down here on the hogback zone along the Front Range during this time of year, the fall and the winter. We have the Chinook winds that usually blow off the snows along this mountain front pretty nicely in this time of year. So it is a kind of a banana belt for Colorado in many ways. When people needed to use mountain resources in terms of plants and animals, especially as those plants started to ripen in the spring down low, and they ripen as you go up in elevation, people would simply move up the mountain front from the Front Range, the lowlands, all the way up in the alpine country, up to Estes Park, and then up to the Continental Divide itself. Conversely, people could also do that from Middle Park and go up and down, up and down, up and down. That's one kind of settlement model that looks at the seasonality, the timing of the year between moving between these different ecosystems. A slightly more complex system, though, is that people might have used what we call a rotary system, where on a yearly basis, they moved in a counterclockwise motion from the Front Range here, Fort Collins, Boulder, moved up into the Laramie Basin, either going up through Cheyenne and across essentially I-80 into the Laramie Basin, or perhaps places like Cameron Pass. Laramie Basin is known to contain abundant bison kills that last, we know, date to the last 10,000 years. Hang out here, again, this would be in the spring time, and then move into places like North Park and Middle Park as the seasons progressed. We don't think they're going up into the high country right there in the early spring, even to the late spring, because all these passes to the west of us in the Indian Peaks and in Rocky Mountain National Park, they're snowbound really until June, and in some cases up in July. So think of the famous 4th of July Valley, for instance, if you ever hiked outside of, say, Nederland, going up towards the park, that snow doesn't go away until after the 4th of July. So if you want to get up into the high country, you have to kind of go counterclockwise to get into some of these basins to take advantage of all these resources. As the year progressed and we started to get cooler in the seasons animals are also moving, and animals are moving up and down into these mountains that we see outside the middle park. And the red arrows show major population movements of humans. And the idea is that humans would go up into the high mountains using raw material sources here in Middle Park and use a series of alpine hunting traps up here in the Front Range, dispatch animals, and then bring all those animals, the parts of them, down for winter stores down here on the Front Range. So again, they're complicated models, but they just help us understand, you know, some reasons why and how people would have interacted with these landscapes over the last 10,000 years or so. So we go about trying to test these ideas. So let's start with the Paleo-Indian use of the mountains. The Paleo-Indians are the very earliest Native American populations in our continent. And for the most part, we think that the high mountains generally aren't used by these earliest people just because they're down here on the grasslands. We have fantastic examples of mammoth kills and bison kills that date to the last 12,000 years ago, containing things like Clovis points here on the left and Folsom points on the right. These are both broken examples, but these are spear points that are common down on the lowlands. We rarely see them up in the high country, suggesting to us that a lot of these glacial valleys were still covered with late Pleistocene ice during these latest kind of Pleistocene period of North America at the end of the last ice age. But beginning about 10,000 years ago, that ice melts pretty rapidly, and we start to see humans pushing up into those high alpine valleys. So as an example of this is my student Brandon, who found this complete Allen-style projectile point, which dates about 9,000 years ago at well over 12,000 feet. This was found in 2017 during our field school at Rollins Pass. And we have about 6 of these within less than a half mile of where we're standing in this particular photo. I was literally about 1.5 feet away from Brandon when he found this point, and I about pushed him over because I was so jealous that this point had been laying there on the surface for at least 9,000 years, and he was the one that stumbled across it. But I was very happy for them, for Brandon. Now these Allen points, what we call late Paleo-Indian, because it's later in time than those earlier spear points, are the most common early people that we see up in the high mountains. An example of one of these sites is the Carey Lake site here in Larimer County. This is in the Rawah Wilderness, just north of Rocky Mountain National Park. And here we have a variety of projectile point bases, as well as tips of those spear points. And when we see all these bases, our inference is that people had successfully gone off on a hunting expedition, broken a lot of their tools, brought meat back to their camp, and they're repairing their tools. They're removing them from their wooden halves. And in doing so, they're just discarding them at their campsite. So we see these in camping site situations. And we have a variety of these Allen sites throughout the Colorado Front Range and Indian Peaks, Rocky Mountain National Park, and here in the Rawah Wilderness. This site is an interesting one. It's in the west branch of the Laramie River. This is adjacent to the Cameron Peak fire that just raged through here the last 2 months. Cameron Peak is right here where my pointer is. But Carey Lake is ducked up into this little tiny side valley up at a little glacial lake there. It's not on its way to a pass. It really has to be a destination that they're going to that place. They weren't passing through that country. So just in conclusion, we have early paleo peoples using these mountain landscapes, but it's really when it becomes advantageous to them once the last of the ice starts to melt about 10,000 years ago. Now, let's talk about game drives. Now, game drives are another type of hunting up in the high country, a little more sophisticated than those earlier Paleo-Indian period hunts that I just talked about. And you might think that our understanding of mountain archaeology might be something that's relatively recent in history, that we just now figured these kinds of things out. But it's surprising to many to know that the very first explorers and mappers in Colorado, here's the Hayden party mapping southern Colorado in 1877, they were the very first to discover some of these alpine game drives. And on the same expedition, Hayden's actually going to push into Mesa Verde National Park and do some of the first kind of publicized accounts of the ruins in Mesa Verde itself. Now, the way the Hayden and King and other kinds of surveys would work is they'd go into the high mountains and they'd climb those mountains and set up transits on top to map all the peaks in, to draw really complex topographic maps of the region. They're really looking for gold and silver and other kinds of precious metals for economic development. But these early surveys, noted a variety of ancient Native American resources up in the high mountains on top of Blanca Peak, just outside of Great Sand Dunes. They came across what they call an eagle trap at the top of Blanca. Near kind of Fisher Peak in the headwaters of the Rio Grande, they came across a game drive with blinds and pits and talked about how ancient hunters of the past must have been hunting bighorn sheep from this particular game drive. Railroad surveys going across Monarch Pass on the way to Gunnison also noted a pretty large game drive. And here at Rollins Pass, which I'll be talking about in the coming minutes, this was known as early as the 1860s, and I'll get into that history in the coming minutes. Now, what were these early folks seeing? Well, they're seeing pretty spectacular kinds of archaeological sites that you can see in some cases from Google Earth. This is an example here from the Front Range, and the photos I'll show you are all ones from the Indian Peaks. This is the Murray Game Drive off Mount Albion on Boulder's mountain property. And the black arrows there point to a long, sinuous wall. You can see it kind of moving its way through that kind of scree kind of system there. Another example of a wall, this is on Rollins Pass itself. This is a rock wall drive line. The slope is really steep. You'll be pretty winded as you're going up this kind of slope, going up towards the top of this particular precipice, this kind of cliff edge. At Murray, as well as Rollins Pass that you see here, these rock walls tend to be only a couple feet tall. We don't think they were 5 feet tall, 6 feet tall, no more than 2 or 3 feet tall at the very most, and in some cases only about 1.5 to 2 feet tall. And the idea is that these walls are not really impenetrable barriers for animals or other kinds of people up there, but they're more so just annoying enough that animals, rather than trying to cross them, will turn and walk alongside these walls. And I'll show you examples of those in the coming minutes. They need rock to build these walls, and so oftentimes they're found very close to these scree fields, although in some cases we do have wooden drive systems, and those need to be close to wooden systems or wood sources. But these are in alpine country, so there's no real wood up here except for low-lying crumholes. So rock walls are part of these systems. Another piece of the system are cairns, and cairns you'll see if you go up hiking in Estes and Rocky. These are rock piles that tend to be two rocks deep, 3 rocks deep, even 4 rocks deep. We can tell when they're natural, or not natural, but ancient in age, by looking at the unbroken lichen profiles that are continuous between these 2 rocks. If we move this rock, the lichens are not growing on the bottom side of this. They actually can bridge or connect those 2 rocks together. Unfortunately, cairns are a difficult one. We have to use them in conjunction with other kinds of archaeological features because modern hikers and new age folks and all sorts of other folks have been building cairns all over the place, especially in the last 50 years. And it's really making it difficult to separate some of the more ancient ones than the more modern kinds of phenomena. But the third kind of feature that we see in the high country that's associated with these game drives are what we call these stone circles or hunting blinds. Here's one that's filled with snow, so we can get a sense of the seasonality of these. This is on Arapaho Pass, so kind of leading between Boulder and Grand County. This one's filled with snow. And so the majority of the year, these things are filled with snow, even if the snow has blown clear for the most part from the past because of just high winds, which, as we know, the Front Range is filled with high winds, and especially in the alpine. These things collect snow. And so they will have snow in them for 9 months out of the year. So we have a narrow window when these things would have been open to be used, and that essentially is July, August, September, and into early October. We know that they're humanly constructed, and not only because of the clustering and the spatial patterning of them, but we also see stacked rocks. And we can look at the lichen profiles within the blinds themselves. We can see that there's oftentimes more rocks on the down side of these features where people were positioning themselves to hunt away from these blinds themselves. Sometimes they contain stone tools themselves. There are several that contain caches of stone tools that someone was working within this blind, made a variety of objects and cached them or stored them into the blind and never retrieved them. Sometimes we even have small warming fires or hearths in the middle of these things. And in those wicked winds up in the Front Range, they're really useful to get out of the winds. You can duck down into these things and kind of get away from some of those winds. Here I am standing at one on Rollins Pass, and you can see Winter Park in the background there. You can see the ski resort looking over to the west. Now those features are important, and we combine their features as well as their spatial locations with the artifacts that we find on these sites as well. And here we have examples of an ancient dart point, which is serrated, kind of like a steak knife finish to here. Much larger tool that's thrown with a spear thrower or an atlatl. And then 2 arrow points, and they have different kinds of notching. Here's a corner notch style with serration on that blade, and a side notch style. And we know from dating these sites down here on the Front Range and elsewhere, the ages of these particular sites. When we find these artifacts, we know these always date to the last 2,000 years. These corner notch ones are generally about 1,500 to 1,000 years old. These side notch ones are typically about 500 years old, give or take, from other excavations. And so when we see these, that helps us understand the periods of which this site was used in the past. That's helpful in dating these sites, as is the map lichen. That little kind of green colored lichen you see in the background there is Rhizocarpum geographicum, the map lichen, which grows at a very slow rate. And we can use the growth of that lichen by looking at its presence on those rock walls, and in some cases the blinds themselves, to help us determine how long it's been since they were first constructed. Finally, we can use charcoal and other kinds of bits of burnt wood and burnt bone and bone itself found in these sites to date these sites. And so by doing this, we've dated dozens of these sites along the Front Range and in the Rocky Mountain National Park. Now, to contextualize this, what I've done is I've done an overview of high altitude archaeology in Colorado, working with one of my students. And what we're interested in knowing is how intensively the mountains were used by peoples of the ancient past, by Native American populations. And in this particular slide, the orange is showing you an outline of all elevations in Colorado that are greater than 3,000 meters, which is just about 10,000 feet above sea level, which is, when you start to get winded, it's the Leadville elevation. If you add up all that land in Colorado that's above 3,000 meters, it ends up being the size of the state of Maryland. So it really is a considerable amount of real estate for Colorado. Now you might say, well, how many sites are up there that date to this ancient Native American tradition? We know there's a lot of silver mining sites, gold mining sites from the 1850s, 60s on. What about the ancient Native populations? Again, this is a question I asked earlier in this talk. Well, we haven't looked at every mountain range yet. You can see some mountain ranges like down here, the Culebras. We have no sites recorded. But archaeologists have recorded over 2,000 prehistoric Native American sites above 3,000 meters, which is pretty incredible. And they range in elevation from Mount Blanca at 4,374 meters all the way down to 10,000 feet or so. We have dense concentrations in the Colorado Front Range, Rocky, Indian Peaks, for example. Large concentrations in the Grand Mesa, which is pretty flat, filled with lakes right by Grand Junction. And then in the San Juans, down kind of outside of Durango, Cortez, Pagosa Springs, etc. Big concentrations there. But you can also see there's areas that don't have as dense of occupation, like Pikes Peak right here, or the West Elks here outside of Gunnison. And we're not quite sure, is that because we haven't spent much time looking up there, or are they really areas that past populations really were not inhabiting? It's a question for another day. Now these game drives, they're pretty amazing. And if we look at the spatial distribution of them, we have about almost 100 of them mapped for Colorado, which again is unheard of compared to all the Western United States, Canada, and North America. About 100 of them. It's about 5% of our entire total sites in the high country for Colorado. Almost 3/4 of those are found in the Colorado Front Range. And we don't think this is a sampling phenomenon. We think this is a legitimate issue that people are really targeting this portion of Colorado to use these hunting features very intensively. And I'll talk about that in the coming minutes, why they chose this particular spot. So here's Rollins Pass. And Rollins Pass is this great gate, as famous historians have labeled it. We have other major passes that have been well known for 100 years in the Front Range. Rollins is certainly one of them. Corona Pass, if you're from Grand County, they don't like the word Rollins Pass or the name Rollins Pass. But it's adjacent to Middle Park, which is one of these high altitude basins. And in working with game managers We know that animals have been using these landscapes for thousands of years, coming and going up and down these slopes seasonally to take away of forage conditions. And so what makes the Front Range so interesting is that within about 30 miles from the lowlands to the highlands and then back down to the lowlands, we can traverse these ranges very, very easily, and so could animals. And so animals and humans have co-adapted and have used these systems to each other's advantage for thousands of years. So Rollins Pass is an example of that kind of phenomenon. Rollins Pass is a pretty interesting spot. It's well known historically. It was first kind of explored as a wagon road in the 1860s, and then beginning in the 1870s, 1880s, a variety of railroad teams tried to use it to build a traverse of the Continental Divide and to drill tunnels down through it. Eventually, David Moffat's going to select this route to build a railroad, and he did in the early 20th century, 1904 to the late 1920s. The two different railroads went across the pass, and you can see them. There's a sinuous pass right here, kind of escapes us right here. It winds its way up and goes through the Needle-Eye Tunnel here and up and over the pass itself at Moffat, at Rollins Pass. This was always meant by David Moffat to be a temporary route. He knew this was just a horrible route because of the harsh winters up there. And so this was a temporary route put in place while he was trying to get financing for, which was very costly, to build the Moffat Tunnel. And that was eventually constructed. He passed away before it was ever finished. But that was constructed, and then the Moffat Road itself over Rollins Pass was eventually abandoned because of the construction and completion of the Moffat Tunnel. But Rollins Pass and this Moffat Road really are famous for railroad lore here in Colorado. The trestles are still in place, really rich kind of railroad history up there, including a couple silent films were filmed on top of the pass. The White Desert's about some crazed railroad workers that are trapped by an avalanche up there, and they kind of go stir crazy because they can't get out. We've done showings of these films and brought in people to play organ piano for them, which is a lot of fun. But yeah, really a big part of Colorado Front Range history is this Rollins Pass. And it wasn't uncommon in the 1920s to have people come from Denver midsummer. It's really hot down low, go up to Rollins Pass for the day, get off at Corona at the very apex, have some snowball fun on top of the world, and then go back at the end of the day. So if you're interested in any of this, this kind of the historical piece of this, some colleagues of mine, Travis and Kate Wright, have put together this pretty nice Images of America book on Rollins Pass. It has a lot of these images in here, as well as a bunch of game drive things that I've helped them with in this particular volume. So you can easily pick this up. It's a really nice illustrative piece. So Rollins Pass is just this classic example of a great gate. Shows generations of use from the game drives. We have the earliest evidence we have at the pass is about 10,000 years ago. The game drives generally within the last 3,000 years, but other sites up there containing pottery and things that are not related to game drives that go within the last 500 years or so. In the 1860s, we had stock trails, and then a wagon road, the railroads, and now it's just a recreation area of immense importance for both Boulder, Grand, and Clear Creek counties along the Continental Divide. And so here we are standing on top of one of the game drives, and on a clear day, if you don't have it too smoggy, you can look out here. This is looking at Haystack Rock there in Boulder, and out to the Front Range. You can see the grasslands leading out towards Nebraska and Kansas. So it's really been an important crossroad or gate for thousands of years. Let's talk about Rollins Pass, what we've been doing up there, the field project. We're not the first to work up there. Jim Benedict and Byron Olson did some foundational work there in the 60s and early 70s, mapping and recording a lot of these sites. And we've been able to pick up and carry the torch on a lot of that work. A lot of that was just descriptive and wasn't published. We've been able to take it a lot further in the last decade. And I've been working up there since 2010, taking field schools up there again in the summertime, in July and August. Here's an example of one of the field schools a couple of years ago. It's a heck of a place to work because what you quickly realize is that animals, and those are the blue arrows that I'm going to depict in this slide here, any animals that are coming from the west could come up from down below, from Fraser and Winter Park, or they could come along the Continental Divide, which is pretty gentle at this particular spot on the landscape. And as they approached the pass itself, here's Rollins Pass right in the middle, they had a choice. They could either go out to the northeast along this large tongue or ridge that kind of ends in cliffs all the way around it, which is where the railroad was, or they could go south along the Continental Divide itself towards James Peak. And in this particular portion of the Front Range, really from here to James Peak, the west sides of all these slopes are nice and gentle. I mean, they're steep, but they're gentle slopes. They're not unnavigable by animals or humans alike. But on the east face, this is the dark shadow that you see right here, it's all pure cliff. And so the animals are really driven to use topography in certain ways. And so when animals had these choices, no matter which way they decided to go, and humans are probably going to haze them or kind of push them in certain ways, they hit these alpine game drives. And each one of those stars represents a separate alpine game drive. There's 12 of them on Rollins Pass, and they all probably function together, although they're spatially separated from each other. So they blocked those animals any which way they could go. And so they probably had, the native folks had runners saying, hey, the animals are going this way, let's position our people on these particular systems to take advantage of them, no matter which way those animals are moving, based upon wind conditions, the timing of the year, etc. Here's an example looking out across that large tongue that goes, or ridge that goes out to the northeast from Rollins Pass itself. The red arrows depict the game drives. The black little lines there are some of the rock walls that we've mapped over the years, and they really are miles worth of rock walls if you add all these things up, and hundreds of those hunting blinds across this entire system. Again, all above tree line. There's no trees anywhere near this, so they're building these out of rock, then using them out of wood. And we don't think in terms of paleoenvironmental reconstruction that wood was available at any time in the past that the wood, say, has rotted away or something like that. Let's take a look at how a couple of these sites happen to work. This is the Olson site, I've named it after Byron Olson. You can see the steep slope here as we're going to the north. This is a modern recreational road that goes across the pass. This is the old wagon road from the 1860s that traversed the pass. And then the railroad grade from the Moffat Road is actually down below us and off site. Rollins Pass and the little, not town site, but kind of railroad station of Corona is there just off screen. Olson and 148 are both massive game drive systems up here. They're two largest of those 12 on the pass. Now this is just a very simplistic depiction to show you some of the rock walls from the Olson site. There's a major one that goes from the west to the east. And as you come across this slope, and as the slope gets really steep here, it turns and goes straight up slope. And I tell you what, if you're to walk up this slope, even with a hiking pole, it's going to wind you no matter how good a shape you are going up this slope here. We have another rock wall that's over a half mile long that goes from the apex of this peak all the way down this face, along this edge here. If you go off this particular edge, you're going to tumble down 500, 600 feet to the glacial lakes down below. These rock walls are all leading up to what we call an apex up here, or an intercept area, where a lot of those hunting blinds are awaiting. But there's also rock walls that look like they're going to the east, leading off to the east behind me in this particular photo, so that if animals were actually moving from the east to the west, they could also be dispatched. So if animals are going in one direction versus the other, these game drive systems are taking that into consideration and are very flexible in design to take advantage of those situations. The way it would work is animals would be hanging down here in the lower portion of Rollins Pass itself, and they'd be downwind. The winds here are pretty much from the west into the northwest. And humans would get behind them and kind of haze them and get them to move slowly. You're not trying to get them to stampede or run. And as they started to move from the west to the east, they'd hit those walls, they'd turn along those walls, and they start moving up slope. And as they moved up slope, they'd come into this intercept area. You can actually see one of the blinds there. You can actually see a modern game trail that actually goes through that intercept area And as they came into that intercept area, they would have been rained down with arrows by all the folks in those hunting blinds. We also have areas that contain lots of broken tools and resharpening flakes, grinding stones like manos metates, that probably represent activities before and after the hunt, but not during the hunt itself, although they really are good view sheds to kind of take into consideration what's going on before, during, and after these hunts. We have ethnographic accounts from caribou hunters in places like Alaska, as well as Greenland and in Canada, that were still using these same kinds of rock-walled game drive systems in the 19th century and early 20th century. And so we have really detailed accounts of women and children getting behind these animals and using music and other kinds of songs to push these animals, to really call them up to the waiting hunters. And so we have some good ways of envisioning how this would happen, giving very similar contexts, in this case, Arctic environments to the far north. To show you this isn't a fluke, this is another example of another game drive at Rollins Pass. These are 3 different ones that are about 3/4 of a mile away from the ones we just looked at, with similar kinds of situations where you have these U or V-shaped rock wall systems. The U's and V's, the apex of them is typically higher in elevation. It's definitely downwind, so the scent is not being given off by the humans themselves. And as you move into these apexes, into the intersections themselves, you get all these red dots, which in these cases on this map are those hunting blinds. And the yellow stars in these particular cases represent arrow points and dart points that we've discovered in our surveys up there. And I think this is all the more remarkable because this site has been known since the 1860s, and you darn well know all those railroad visitors hiking across this environment would have picked up anything they saw in the past. And so these things must have been incredibly rich sites at some points in the past, and the fact that we still can find things up there is simply amazing. In terms of the seasonality, as I said, we're looking at kind of a July to October kind of events. This is October 1972. You can see the rock wall clearly there. But after that point, the animals are going low in elevation. And so the humans are following them down slope. And it becomes pretty unbearable to spend much time up there on a lot of kind of fall and winter days in the high country. Again, other examples of rock walls. Those ones I just showed you are a little taller. These ones themselves up on the north side of Rollins Pass are pretty small. And here we have 2 little rock walls. The modern hiking trail traverses right through here. And so oftentimes we'll be working up there and we'll have hikers. In some cases, if we're up there late in the year, hunters come right through. They'll walk right through that wall and won't even notice they've walked across that wall. But again, when you map these things out, you look at the spatial association with those hunting blinds and look where all the artifacts are, it looks like a really nice package deal for how these particular sites were utilized in the past. Again, other examples of hunting blinds. This is another one overlooking Rollins Pass. They would be using these kinds of things for the hunt themselves. But if you look down there, looking back to the west, as you get into this crumb holes and out onto this point right here, we have archaeological sites tucked into all this crumb holes here. And we think they would have retreated to places like this after the hunt because they can get in there and have fuel wood, get some protection from the winds. We also have occupations around many of the glacial lakes in this area. So we think that those are also destinations post-hunt, to get away from the hunts locations themselves, which are pretty exposed kinds of settings. Again, examples of these blinds. This is the real famous one from the Olson site, the blind itself, one of the blinds, excuse me, in this massive rock wall that goes for over a half mile up to 148 there to the west. Here you can see it here. When we surveyed along this wall, when we first started this project, I had students kind of really slowly walking the wall and we do transects and stuff. And we were finding broken projectile points within this rock wall itself, as if shots had missed animals and they'd hit that rock and broken the tips off and got lodged in that wall and were simply never retrieved. In this photo in the lower left here, you can actually see a faint line right here. That's the modern game trail that goes right through this intercept area because there's no rock right there, although there's pretty massive scree to the left and to the right of this particular spot. So we know animals today are using this particular pathway of least resistance. So there's a lot of ethology of animal behavior that plays into this. We've set up game cameras in different locations, as well as just made observations, and people have sent us photos as well to help us understand how animals might use these systems. And here's just a couple examples of animals from the Cone Drive mountain system, which is closer to Berthoud Pass, so a little bit south of Rollins Pass. But here we have mule deer led by their leader, this big buck, walking along these rock wall systems, and they're just about to go into one of these intercept areas where it's surrounded by those blinds. So if this was 1,000 years ago, those deer probably would not have made it out of this particular game drive system. Now, Cone Mountain's a little more isolated than Rollins Pass. Rollins Pass is very easy to access, and so several other sites are as well. Cone is very, very far off any sort of trail system. So the animals love to hang out in that area versus, say, Rollins Pass or the Front Range in general. And so we've seen bighorn sheep use this Cone Mountain system as well, including the big rams. Working through Cone Mountain, we've actually found a whole series of interconnected drive systems that looks like Rollins Pass in many ways, including some wooden drive elements still standing on some of these systems. And what's really neat about Cone Drive or Cone Mountain is it's just outside of the town of Empire, which is off Highway 40 going towards Berthoud Pass. And I would say 9 times out of 10, if I'm driving on Highway 40, as I go right before or right after Cone Mountain, and it'll be on my north side or my right-hand side if I'm going to Winter Park, there'll be bighorn sheep hanging out right there. Typically ewes, but we're just below these systems. And so I think these people of the past were ingenious in terms of knowing where animals are going to congregate based upon seasonal mobility and really knowing how to intercept them in a very profitable way. Now, figuring out what they're hunting up in the high country is a little bit difficult. I mean, we have our suspects like bighorn sheep as well as elk, mule deer, but it also could be bison as well. And we're doing different kinds of projects to do this. We just finished a 5-year survey in Rocky Mountain National Park, all over the park, looking at ice patches, which are these long-lasting ice features. They're kind of miniature glaciers that really work as nature's kind of deep freeze systems. And because of global climate change, they are pretty quickly melting back, and we're watching these things melt back pretty aggressively. And as they do so, we're surveying the forefields, kind of in front of these things as things melt out of them. We're looking for cultural artifacts, and we have found cases of that throughout Colorado, but we primarily find fauna. And so here's examples of bighorn sheep that are melting out of this ice. In other cases, we're finding bison bone. So here's a bison upper arm bone, a humerus. It only dates to 210 years before present, but we have bison coming out of this ice that's at least 3,000 years in time. And so pretty good reservoirs for kind of paleoclimate and paleo zoology. Here we have a mule deer with the antlers still attached. So that's one way that we're trying to understand the kinds of animals that would have been present in good numbers at these ice patches, as well as game drives in the past. Kind of summarizing what we had to say about the Olson site: lots of blinds, almost a mile of rock walls. Half the blinds that were excavated yield artifacts that really confirms that these were humanly constructed features. A variety of artifacts, including 43 arrow points, which is pretty spectacular given that it's right next to the railroad. And then it was really important because we actually identified bighorn sheep bone at this particular site. Some of those blinds actually have broken bighorn sheep bone in them, suggesting that either before, during, or after the hunt, peoples are processing some of this bighorn sheep and preparing it to schlep down to lower elevation kinds of camps there. So that was a pretty useful thing that we learned at this particular site. And like many of these game drives, it's not just used once, it's used for thousands of years. And we have a variety of dates on Olson that show it was used within the last 4 centuries, a little bit earlier in time, about 1,200 to 1,300 years ago, and then including some occupations about 3,000 years ago. So once people figured this out, they kept coming back and using this time and time again. I just want to show you a couple brief other little things that we can learn from game drives, and then I'll kind of wrap up the presentation. But I want to tell you a little bit about the use of bows. Rollins Pass is pretty interesting because it's named after John Quincy Adams Rollins, who was an early entrepreneur in the area, and he set up the wagon road across the pass. And in 1873, he wrote an article to the Rocky Mountain News talking about all the things he was finding up there. He thought it was a battleground because there were so many arrows and other things that he was finding up on top of that alpine tundra. But what he also found up there was a 3-foot tall wooden bow. And other researchers working at ice patch sites in Wyoming, as well as Canada and Alaska, and overseas in places like Norway, have also found wooden bows melting out of ice patch and other kinds of Arctic environments. So this is not necessarily too surprising that a bow was found here, probably just left against a wall and forgotten years ago. So we can ask, how would bow hunters use a place like Rollins Pass and all these blinds? And we can look at the ethnographic record, places like Inuit populations up in Alaska, and they're just using these relatively simple bows. They're not compound bows. And typically your effective distance, meaning how far you're willing to shoot this thing, and make sure that you're accurate with it, is generally somewhere around 20 to 25 yards or 20 to 25 meters. And so what happens when we look at these game drives from that perspective? Well, they contain neat features, but to me, the most important thing is the spatial arrangement of all these blinds, walls, cairns, artifacts, etc. And here's an example at Olson site. With all those blinds, they're red or pink dots that you see here. And if they overlap in terms of their radius, in this case 25 meters, that image will get darker and darker and darker red in color. And so we have a series of overlaps here, meaning if you position hunters in each of those blinds within these kind of overlapping areas, their shots could potentially hit each other. You could hit other hunters, or you could really effectively, communally, really rain down those animals from a variety of different angles, all from about the same distance or not. Again, maximizing your potential take. And we have really nice examples on multiple game drives where it looks like animals that were coming from the west to the east or east to the west, and again, designing them to be very flexible depending upon where the animals are coming from. To show you this is not an accident, this is up at another part of Rollins Pass. Again, same phenomenon. Again, now I'm only at 20 meters rather than 25, but the darker the red, the greater degree of overlap of those blind shot distances. And on the biggest drive itself, look at this really nice red area here. All the blinds are overlapping there, right where those walls are converging or turning into the point of that V, right where the intercept is. And many of the projectile points that we find are right on the edge of that 20 to 25 meters away, suggesting to us that these are lost shots, that people are making these shots, they miss, and they never retrieve that weaponry, or perhaps that the animal died within the animal and they didn't retrieve it some way. But they're about that kind of magic distance away from the blind center. Examples of some of the dart points that we found on that particular site using that survey strategy. And then finally, the size of the blinds. Again, another kind of characteristic about these blinds themselves is how big they happen to be. And here we have students measuring the size and how high they happen to be. And using different kinds of measures, trying to understand how many people could fit in those blinds. Is it kind of a very small single person kind of blind, holding only one person? Perhaps you and your friend, your buddy, or perhaps your child that you're teaching to hunt. But in some cases, larger kind of hot tub size blinds. And the question would be, where would those happen to be on these particular sites? And again, interesting patterns that our very largest blinds are at that apex in the center of these blind type systems. And the question is, are those command control, where kind of elder, senior hunters with lots of experience and talent are helping the other hunters that are out there kind of dictating what they should be doing, and they're all in the smaller one-person type blinds? Or are these the kinds of blinds where people are hanging out before and after the hunt, chatting, eating some food, playing games, that kind of stuff? We know this ethnographically that people, there's a lot of downtime when you're hunting, waiting for the conditions to ripen. And so these big blinds might represent that as well. But again, different ways that we can use these game drives to learn different things about these past peoples. So finally, why such intense use of the alpine country? Why here in the Colorado Front Range? Well, I think it has a lot to do with the positioning of the Front Range itself, in terms of lots of people living down low like they do today, and a very easily accessible high country just 30 miles to the west. and then animals all over the place, the Serengeti, literally, of Colorado there. And so we're looking at a seasonal kind of signature of people using that during the late fall, kind of right now, this time of year, October, really, for communal hunting. We also think it occurs during a specific time of prehistory when things are pretty tough down here in the lowlands. People are running out of food because they've overhunted their local patches. They're not farmers, they're still hunter-gatherers, meaning they eat everything that's wild. They're not growing things, and they're not going to the grocery store, right? And so they're supplementing their diet by going up into these more costly places to visit, like the high country. And then finally, there's social reasons for aggregation and building walls. I mean, this is classic, you know, let's all gather together and work together and share the fruits of our labor. And the meat itself would have been important, but those social bonds and meeting up with friends and family, exchanging information, exchanging meats, we can't discount that. It's not just about what they ate, it's really about those social bonds, but have also been a very important part of this story that I've been telling you today. So just to summarize, a couple different things, different ways this lecture could go, but the highest mountains have been used since the earliest colonization by the very first Native American groups. We call them the Paleo Indians. Some 10 to 12,000 years ago is when our best evidence is here in Colorado. It's not really until the ice melts, though, that we see intensive use of those mountains by those earliest peoples, but the earliest peoples are getting up there. It's going to take 7,000 or 8,000 more years, though, before we start to see the use of these game drives, beginning in 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. And if you have anything to take away from this talk today, is just how much strategy and ingenuity went into the design of these hunting systems. These were not just, hey, let's give it a shot. They obviously worked. They were modified, kind of messed with, improved upon through subsequent generations. But this was a really ingenious kind of system. And I think it was set up here because it worked, and the same cultural units used this for successive generations for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And this high country, we can't discount the relationship that we have between the lowlands and the highlands here. And we have a really interesting thing here with the kind of Front Range, Denver, Fort Collins, Colorado Springs. Because the mountains are so close, those lowland communities really claim those mountains as their own. And that's a little bit different than other kinds of mountain settings, places like Gunnison and Crested Butte or say Telluride, where they're very remote kinds of places and very small populations. Here, the connection between the lowlands and highlands is probably as old as people have been in this country. And so we have to really think about both the lowlands and highlands together rather than separating them out when we're separating or trying to figure out this overall story. So to acknowledge lots of folks, I couldn't accomplish this work without all sorts of great students at the undergraduate and graduate level. Many of my students have gone on to work for the Forest Service, and Park Service, other kinds of agency. A variety of great funding sources, including the Jim and Audrey Benedict Fund for Mountain Archaeology, Rocky Mountain National Park, Arapaho Roosevelt National Forest, etc. So with that, I'd like to conclude and thank you for spending a little bit of your Saturday with me, and hopefully this got us thinking about mountains and having fun when things get back to normal. Thanks so much.
Dr. LaBelle, thank you so much. And we'll wrap that up for today, for today's program. If you guys have any questions or anything else regarding programs upcoming for the museum, please just shoot me an email. All of that contact information is on our website. So I hope everybody has a lovely weekend. Thanks again, Dr. LaBelle.
You bet.